right, so if you are here for virtual or not so virtual formative assessment, and this is part of our summer learning blitz. So if you are not familiar with the blitz, or if this is the first one that you're joining, welcome. We're at the office, and Rich and I are the co-hosts for today, co-facilitating the learning today, and it's interesting to be in a space where sometimes our technology works and sometimes it doesn't. But we've all been there this past year. So moving on, if you need the sign in, I'm going to go ahead and drop it in one more time for those of you just joining. So the whole idea around the Blitz this year, our theme is thinking about the whole child. And when we think about the whole child, we often think about Bloom's taxonomy, and it's a set of 3 hierarchical models used to classify educational learning objectives into levels of complexity and specificity. And these models were named after Benjamin Bloom, who chaired the committee of educators that devised the taxonomy. And so we often in education focus so much on Bloom that sometimes we forget about the Maslow stuff. And we all remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We probably all learned about it in our prep programs. So we want to make sure that we are considering Maslow's work as well. And so one of the quotes that we like to use is, you can't do the Bloom stuff until you take care of the Maslow stuff. And so the Science of Learning and Development Alliance, they've said that we need to have a deep focus on building strong relationships with our students and staff, and fostering that sense of community and sense of belonging. And we do this by attending to that social and emotional and cognitive development, which is not in conflict with efforts to accelerate academic learning. And so we say that these strategies are mutually dependent, reinforcing. And so the National Commission on Social and Emotional and Academic Development, a Nation at Hope, and we have linked the Nation at Hope information, and I can drop it in at the end. They talk about how children learn best when we treat them as human beings, and when we focus on social, emotional, as well as their academic needs. And so as we think about coming into the school year and where students are at, where they've been, the things that they've experienced through our pandemic, we have to continue to promote social, emotional, and academic learning. And that really, it's not a distraction from the work of academics around our core content areas, but it's the real work, and it's how instruction can succeed. And so we focus on this whole idea around educating the whole learner, which means that we have to take into account their social, emotional, cognitive, character, physical, and academic needs as well. So instead, the mindset that it should be used to inform the entire educational system. So we need to focus on all of these and not always just the academics. And if you are interested in other sessions around the whole child, we have a couple of different offerings. Intro to the Whole Child Model will be offered on August 11th, and Intro to Social Emotional Learning will be offered on August 20th as Blitz sessions. Or you can contact our school health consultant, Dr. Cynthia Cook, and she would be happy to support your school or district with any of the needs around Whole Child Model or Coordinated School Health Model. Okay, I think my co-host is here. Rich, are you here?
I am. Hello. Although I'm still having some connection issues, so I'm going to keep my camera off for now.
All good.
Okay.
No worries. Okay. So today, Rich and I are going to talk to you a little bit about virtual or not so virtual formative assessment. And my name is Heather Rottermond, and I'm an assessment and instruction consultant here at Wayne Risa. And I'll let Rich introduce himself.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Rich Baolor, science consultant here at Wayne Risa, and I'm excited to be here with you guys. So thanks for coming.
So today, even though the title is virtual, not so virtual formative assessment, we've kind of connected it to some content area science. And so you can see how we can use the formative assessment process when we think about science in particular. But any of these things that we talk about today can certainly stream to the other content areas. So we ask about while we're in our learning space today that you present and participate in the learning, and we understand connection issues like Rich has his camera off, I have my camera on. It happens, we understand. We ask that you just be open to some new thinking and feel free to mute your microphone or stop your video if necessary. And sometimes those earbuds or headphones are really helpful for that background noise if you have that feedback. So our topics today are, we're going to talk a little bit about accelerated learning and Tier 1 instruction. We'll go through the formative assessment process, and then we're going to talk about low stakes, high value probes. So we'll begin our session with, not really starting with a connector, but we're kind of starting with some information gathering from you. So Rich and I were curious around your degree. To what degree do you feel that these are true in your context? So we put a scale up there for you. So 1 through 5, a strongly disagree to a strongly agree. And we're going to ask you to put the degree in which you see this being true in your context, wherever you're teaching or wherever you're from. So the first one is Tier 1 instruction includes all content areas. So we're going to invite you to open the chat and put in the number to the degree of which it is true in your. All right, Rich, what are we seeing?
I'm seeing a lot of 4s and 5s. There is a 1 in there as well, but the majority are 4s and 5s.
Okay, excellent. All right, so our second question, and it's the same idea. Tier 1 instruction includes the intentional use of the formative assessment process to support learning. To what degree is that true in your context?
Seeing a lot of 4s, some 5s. Excellent. Okay. A couple of 3s in there as well. We might be preaching to the choir today, Heather.
That's okay. I've seen some familiar faces, and we've had assessment discussion around formative assessment. So I know that we probably are preaching to the choir. Okay, the third one, Tier 1 instruction means alignment to grade level standards.
All right, again, we're a smattering of 3s, but mostly 4s and 5s on this one as well.
Then our last question, Tier 1 instruction includes intentional, purposeful planning.
Again, looking at a lot of 4s and 5s here as well. And I'll just mention that, we talk in education as well a lot about, do beliefs drive actions or do actions drive beliefs? And I think it's important to look at those things, because I'm not sure that there's really one answer to that, but in terms of research and practice, we see a lot of variability in that. And so I think we're starting off here just to plant the seed of, with a lot of talk in the press about learning loss and other sort of challenges of the last year. We want to just set some, do a little level setting and see where are we with these topics, because they are critically important for all kids and all learning. So,
yeah, I think this is really important. This is why we wanted to start there, because we are hearing words like remediation, learning loss, and really like deficit-minded words surrounding our students as they enter the fall. And so we really wanted to start with Tier 1 instruction, because it is something that we strongly believe in here at RISA, but that research supports having strong Tier 1 instruction. And so we wanted to provide a resource to you if you weren't aware, but MDE has provided some guidance around accelerated learning, because this is another word that we keep hearing, accelerate learning. And they have created a document with the support and input from ISDs and educators around the state. And so the one that is displayed for you here, and we're going to drop it in the chat for you as well, is the Tier 1 grade level instruction. And so really when we talk about accelerated learning, we're talking about all those practices that encompass good, solid tier 1 instruction. And so we believe that tier 1 instruction includes utilizing a variety of opportunities and techniques to gather evidence of student learning. So this is really encompassing the formative assessment process. And this is why we wanted to start here today. And so if you look at the graphic to the left, the definition around accelerated learning, and this is one that's been put out in multiple contexts. To what degree or to what beliefs or practices might educators hold that align with that goal? If you read the text, we'll open up the chat again. We're a small group, we can also open it up to unmute. But what beliefs or practices might educators hold that align to this idea of accelerated? So if an educator were to hold the belief that aligned with the goal around accelerated learning, what might we see that teacher doing? What beliefs might that teacher have? Okay, so I'm seeing the practice of assessing prior knowledge to ensure that we know where our students are currently. Excellent. Thank you, Michelle. Michelle went to misaligned. Oftentimes we want to teach foundational skills that students are lacking, but that are not connected to the new or upcoming learning. Absolutely. I think that goes along with that remediation, like you can't do this because you don't have that skill. So we have to give you that skill first before you can access the grade level. Thanks, Laura. Yes, frequent checks for understanding. Something that I think about around misalignment might be never providing students with access to like grade level text, even if maybe their reading level might not be on grade level, but even having that access to grade level text.
Yeah, Heather, I guess I would add to, I think just kind of going along with what's been put in the chat so far, as a science instructor or as a science educator, a lot of times it is hard. What's the difference between what a third grader should know and what a fifth grader should know in terms of matter, right? So the content matters, if I could just use that word again, and that is really difficult, at least from a science content aspect, because a lot of these ideas that we're talking about or that we want kids to develop really exist along a developmental spectrum. And I wouldn't expect an eighth grader to talk about matter in the same way as a fourth grader, for example, but specifically what that means is sometimes hard to define without resorting to, basically just asking students to use certain words. And so I think that's, to me, what I see in science classrooms a lot in terms of misaligned assessments are an over-reliance on vocabulary use versus conceptual understanding or application of certain concepts. But hopefully we have a solution, at least a partial solution for that coming up later.
I think we do. So we want to really align our beliefs and actions and practices with accelerated learning, with good tier 1 instruction. And so we want to think about comprehensive and balanced assessment systems. And I like to use this graphic to show that there are certain needs for certain kinds of assessments. And I know teachers hate to hear that M-STEP is needed, but it is. And but it's not needed in the same way that you need those day-to-day things that you do in the classroom. And so Rich and I had we had two questions that we want to pose around thinking about a comprehensive and balanced assessment system. And so as you look at the graphic, you'll notice the very bottom where it says formative, that's longer on purpose because it indicates that these are the things that happen frequently in the classroom. And we're constantly collecting evidence of student learning, things that we're doing in the classroom, the routines that we have that are geared towards evidence gathering are student-centered. We're providing feedback. We're using the information from those evidence gathering strategies and techniques to make decisions about what we do next. We're engaging students in self-assessment. We're engaging them in reflection. So all of those good things that happen on the day-to-day inside the classroom. And as we move up, you'll notice that benchmark and summative are a little bit smaller. And that's because they happen periodically or less frequently than do the formatives. But what I want you to notice at the very bottom is that all of these things should be connected to learning outcomes. So we should be connecting whatever is happening in the classroom to our learning goals, or which are connected to our content standards. And so, Rich, we had two questions that we were going to ask the group today. So the two questions that we were going to ask are, where do you see, at what point do we have high value for learning and low stakes? We can use the chat or we can open it up for discussion. But where in our system of assessments do we see low stakes but high value for learning? Okay, I'm seeing it come through. Yep. Formative, it's low stakes, meaning that the stakes tied to it are not as hefty, like the accountability is not as hefty as you might have with the summative. We're in our high value for learning. We're gathering a lot of information when we're doing it inside the classroom. And so that's why M-STEP, even though we may not like it as teachers, there is a use for it. And our dislike for it in the classroom level, it's really because we don't use it to inform our instruction like we do the things that we gather on the day-to-day basis.
Heather, I want to address, Marilyn asked a really valid question up here in the chat. How do we connect M-STEP to benchmarks for the struggling scholar who may be 2 or 3 grade levels behind, knowing the scholar does not put effort into the test? And I think there's a lot of, that's a very deep and loaded question, but it also speaks to the purpose and the benefits of formative assessment as a frequent way to engage students, right? Because if a student walks into a summative assessment like the M-STEP and hasn't seen any success or doesn't feel like they have success, we can use formative assessments to scaffold those. And I think that's a really important point, especially coming from a science background, where we know that so many brilliant, smart kids exit science or disengage with science at too early an age. And I would argue that a lot of that has to do with really poor summative assessments, right? And so if I can give a kid some success on a more frequent basis using formative assessment, and that student starts to build identity through that, that's a win-win-win, because not only do I know that the kid is building identity towards more scientific thinking, but those little successes are what build towards greater successes. And so later on, for a more high stakes test, for whether it's a test that might get some kid into a specialized program, or if we're talking about the MCATs later, those little successes build towards bigger successes. And so I would encourage Marilyn and others to find those formative assessments, not only as ways to inform your own instruction, but also to help the students build some success and identity towards whatever it is that the learning goal is that you're working towards. So I just wanted to throw that in there as another plug for formative assessment.
I think that's a really good point. And one point that I failed to make when I was sharing the slide, because I was so excited to talk about low stakes and high value, was that there's not an assessment that exists that meets everybody's needs, right? Like if you think about M-STEP, teachers would say it's not meeting my needs instructionally. And that's okay, because other people use the M-STEP for other reasons. Like, curriculum directors use M-STEP results to make programming decisions or professional development decisions. Policymakers, whether we like it or not, they use M-STEP results in very different ways. And so because there isn't an assessment that can meet everybody's needs, we have to have a comprehensive and balanced assessment system. And this means that it includes a variety of assessments that provide evidence around student learning in various ways. And so today, our focus is really going to be on the formative piece of it. And so how do we engage students in that process so that we can really get insight into their thinking and their understanding so that it better helps us to make good instructional decisions, provide feedback to move forward in the learning. So when we talk about, whenever I talk about assessment, I like to use this image because assessment is really a bridge between teaching and learning because it's the core process within instruction. One of my favorite researchers, Dylan Willem, he's a guru around formative assessment, and I love how he describes teaching because he describes it as engineering effective learning environments for students. And he often talks about the key features of these environments, of effective learning environments, that they create student engagement and allow teachers and learners and their peers to ensure that the learning is moving in the intended direction. And the only way that we know that it's moving in the right direction is through assessment, right? And we'll talk a little bit more later, but it doesn't always have to be a test, so to say. There are many things that we do within our classrooms in both formal and informal ways that we can gather evidence of student learning to move our students forward.
Yeah, Heather, let me jump in on that image as well. And I almost did this to you without telling you, but I'm not going to. But here's a very simple bridge, right? A bridge is a structure. Think of all the beautiful bridges and all the different structures that those forms that those bridges can take on, right? And I think an overemphasis on M-step style or certain types of assessments really limits how we can get kids from one point to another, right? So if we're gonna, if I could extend this metaphor into an engineering or science context, I would say, let's look for as many different types of bridges, right? They all serve a function to get from one place to another, but they take on very different structures depending on the materials that you have, depending on the span of, Marilyn brought up earlier, some kids are several grade levels behind, right? A much bigger span. All right, well, maybe we need a different type of bridge to get them there. But the purpose is still getting them from point A to point maybe B.5, right? And then B. And so I think that's another nice way to think about it is we don't have to use the same bridge all the time. There are multiple different things that we can use. And hopefully we'll give you an example of that later on.
Okay, so I like to use, this is the definition that we use in Michigan, and it was developed by it's a very long acronym. It's a very long group of folks. I think it's the Council of Chief State Superintendents. But this is one that Michigan has adopted as their definition of formative assessment. And if we think about formative assessment in the classroom context, it's really to provide teachers and students with information about where they're at in the learning. And notice I said teachers and students, because students should be users and consumers of where they are at in their own learning. Because the whole idea of the formative assessment process is really centered around building up our students to be self-directed learners, to be motivated to be self-directed learners. And so at the classroom level in the formative context, the essential question that we ask is what comes next in the learning. And so to answer this question, we look at evidence that is gathered while learning is taking place in relation to our learning goal or the learning progression. And so you're going to notice that that in this definition and what I just said around students being key users, they're also key decision makers too. And that goes along with like learning tactic adjustments. And so when students know where they're at in their own learning, they too can make adjustments as to how they are learning, which is really important. in terms of building up that self-efficacy, but also motivating to be a self-directed learner. And so when we involve our students in the formative assessment process, this could be through self-assessment, it could be through reflection, it could be through feedback. It also helps to build up their metacognition, their self-efficacy, but it also helps them to be engaged in their learning. And so we like to use this graphic to show that it's a process. It's not a specific kind of test, and that's something that that some people think it is. It's not a specific kind of test, but it's really a process, and it really centers around 3 questions. Where are we going? What do my students understand now? And then how do we get to the learning target? And then we continue that process throughout the learning. And something to note is that Hattie has done extensive meta-analyses around formative assessment, and he found that it ranks up like a 0.9. And this is something that we do in the classroom, but if we do it with intention and purpose, we can really reap the benefits of moving our students forward in their learning and involving our students in the learning. And so what research has found over the past year during the pandemic around virtual formative assessment and kids moving into a virtual space is that what we do in terms of the formative assessment process in the classroom, in the face-to-face classroom, is no different than what we would do in a virtual space, right? It all begins with establishing our clear learning intentions or our learning targets. We communicate some success criteria to our students, and this helps our students know what success will look like when they've met that criteria, when they've met that learning goal. We build in opportunities for students to engage in self-assessment. They can ask questions. They're engaged in discussions. We provide feedback to our students, whether it be a whole group feedback, small group feedback, one-on-one feedback, using various modes. It could be using technology like Google Docs. It could be sending voice recordings. It could be a video recording, or even just using the old-fashioned pen. But then we also want to give our students opportunities to revise and redo their work based on the feedback that they've been given. So all of these things that they have found to be good practice in the face-to-face setting, it's the same in the virtual setting. And so our question to the group today is, what are some ways that you find out what students are thinking?
This is where we steal your ideas.
If you think to in your classroom, and if you're teaching inside your classroom, or you're working with a group of students, whatever your context might be, what are the ways that you find out what students are thinking?
So we got exit tickets. Laura, can you say a little bit more about what kinds of exit tickets you're using? KWL charts, surveys, class discussions. I love it. Flipgrid.
Somebody said observation. I'm so happy I'm seeing that, because it's something that I think we don't do enough of. I like the red, green, yellow tags. Okay.
This might be a good time. One of the other things that we're hearing about as we head back into classrooms, is definitely about social and emotional learning. One of the best exit tickets I saw last year was, this happened to be in a middle school, but the middle school teacher asked, as an exit ticket, did someone use your idea today? Did someone else use your idea today? And I thought, what a great way to build community. And also that means, like, if you kind of read into that, it's not only social and emotional and cultural, but also that means that there was some discussion happening, right? And so we can infer from those answers what kinds of things kids are actually engaged with. And I thought that was a lovely way to check.
So the good news, based on everything that I'm kind of seeing through the chat, you're already doing a lot of really good things. So some of the ways in which we gather evidence and some of the strategies or the routines, we do it through observations. We look at student work. We look at their artifacts. What are they producing? We listen in onto discussions. We listen to what students are saying and how they're responding. We pose questions and we listen for responses. We activate prior knowledge. And then the last one is we engage them in some peer and self-assessment. And so I saw the thumbs up and the thumbs down. That's directly related to a quick self-assessment of where they think they're at within the learning. All of these things that you're doing are really, really strong routines and strategies that can help support the formative assessment process. Rich, did you want to talk about this quote?
Yeah. So, gosh, where to even start with this one? Well, first of all, I just kind of love the quote. I think it goes along really nicely along with another sort of famous teacher thing that we've all seen is the every kid needs a champion from Rita Pearson. And that kids don't really care what you have to tell them unless they know that you care. And I think one of the best ways that we can do that is really being interested in what kids are thinking, not just what they know or can repeat, but in what they really think. And as a former middle school science teacher, I can tell you that like when I started doing more of this, the kids who were encultured to be in more of a parrot, right? Like soak it in, parrot back what they think they wanted me to hear. They struggled a little bit with that idea because I would ask them, why do you think that? That's not, or at least at the time, it was not like a normal thing for a lot of teachers to be asking the students. So I take this quote as a way of, reframing formative assessment in being interested in what the kids actually think, rather than, specifically just what they know or what they can parrot back to me. So that's sort of my starting point with this quote.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's oftentimes our students are so focused in on like points or a grade that that they're really merely only doing school, they're complying with school. And so I think this quote really pushes on that. It really gets at the heart of teaching and learning and how we can provide opportunities for students to show us their thinking, but that we have to be truly interested in what they're thinking. And so one way that Rich and I really feel that is a powerful way to uncover what students are thinking is through the use of probes.
Yeah, and I should say also that Heather, the content of this comes out of a PD that we did last year with a small PLC style group of teachers. And we provided the probes to these teachers, asked them to use them in their class. And then we came back and we shared student work. And so you'll see an example of that. And these were all science teachers. And since I didn't really know who was going to show up today, but I wanted to start with this little, how are the new science standards different than the old science standards? And most of you, or hopefully most of you guys know that in 2015, the Michigan science standards shifted from Huskies and Glicks over to the new Michigan science standards, which are based on the NGSS. And really what that means is that students are using it's not just what they know or what they can repeat, but actually engaging in the practices of science and of the cross-cutting concepts, right? And so prior to that, I'll take one step back. Prior to that, most classrooms were based on some outmoded ideas about students. And, kind of, I think we all, like, again, I'm going to make an assumption that when we all went through teacher training schools or certification programs, we were kind of integrated with this idea that students are not empty vessels just to be filled up with knowledge that we have, right? Or they're not blank slates. That was another one. That students are actually, constructing or sense making, and that's how the brain actually works. And so a couple nice things about the new, new ways to look at science is that kids really do understand a lot more than we think, or than we're aware of. They're not as concrete as once thought, and that's why formative assessment becomes really, really important. because if I only rely on students like vocabulary, and I think also of our English language learners, right? There's a lot more understanding that they have than they have language to express. Okay, and so some of these probes and the way we're looking at these things aren't going to be necessarily like right or wrong answer kind of things, but really informative for the teacher to figure out what are the students thinking. And now, once I have the sort of the raw material that the students have given me of what they're thinking, now as an instructor, I can create the conditions to move that thinking ahead towards more academic concepts or towards more academic language. And so I wanted to start off with that. And again, kind of push back on the empty vessel or misfilled vessel. I don't know. All right, go ahead, Heather. So again, like this last year has been immensely difficult to engage students in the practices of science, right? In disrupted classroom situations, in hybrid classroom situations, in online classroom situations. It's really hard to engage in the practices of science, but it's important to keep this in mind, that because maybe even like, we're living through a pandemic right now. Maybe this has some lessons for us even, beyond the classroom, but we engage with the natural world. And then those observations create questions in our heads that we need to investigate. And for most of us, that means we seek out data. And in terms of science, we have to not only seek out data, but create data, right? We have to create investigations that make data for us to analyze. And then we also have to make sense of the data, come up with an explanation or a solution to a problem, and then start the whole thing all over again, right? So this is really what a science classroom should look like. This is what a learning cycle should look like. And that means that there are multiple opportunities for formative assessment. If we're doing science in an iterative way, right, where students are trying to sense make versus, again, just digest and repeat, then formative assessment, there are multiple opportunities to do that, okay? And this is really why we landed on the probes. Heather mentioned earlier low stakes and high value. And so I'm also the belief that we can't figure out what kids know and are able to do simply by mimicking M-step questions, right? That's not really what we're after, but it's also very difficult to write good assessments. We did, as the NGSS came around, we spent some time trying to create these. I was actually on one of the M-step writing teams. And so, but, by experience, I can tell you it's really, really hard to write good three-dimensional assessments. And so the probes provided us with some ready-made assessments that were already aligned to the standards that we could implement right away, right? And we could select them for different purposes. And so I really, from a student standpoint, they're low stakes and they really ask the students to make their thinking visible. From a teacher standpoint, they're super flexible, they're short and produce artifacts in a pretty, I won't say easy, but in a pretty efficient way. And that means that the information that they give us can be